Tashdale, welcome everybody to the Awam Tibetan Buddhist Institute and our Sunday meditation looking into the nature of things through the teachings of the Buddha and various other experts that have come along as a part of that. We started out with some basic introductory information about basic kinds of things that are associated with the historical Buddha and his teachings and so forth. And then we talked a little bit about some of the core principles of the individual liberation, the path of individual liberation, and some of the core things that then carry forward from there. And then we also looked at the path of altruism or the Bodhisattva and some of the practices that are linked to us from that aspect. And so now we're taking in the adventure of going into the path of Tantra. And the book itself is mostly about this. This is the biggest part of what we're going to look at. But we're getting a little bit of an introduction to it today. So the path of Tantra is sometimes referred to as the path of transformation as well. It uses transformative methods to facilitate and process becoming a Buddha. But it also uses such processes to address specific afflictive emotions and mental obscurations that block or interfere with our progress on the path. So compared to the use of renunciation on the path of individual liberation and antidotes on the path of altruism. So this is a little bit different kind of an approach to that. According to the path of Tantra, the other paths are not sufficiently complete, leaving some very subtle obscurations to total liberation, and the other paths take too long, potentially many eons or at least several lifetimes. So the Tantra is said to purify all remaining subtle obscurations and enable you to achieve liberation in this lifetime or at the time of death. So that's the basic format that is used, expectation that is used as a part of this, is speed up the process and go into a deeper kind of a process. Now, people from those traditions probably aren't going to agree with all of that, but at least that's the model that is presented from the people within the path of Tantra. So, there is some symbolism of wisdom and compassion, a meditational Buddha form to focus on attaining liberation and qualities and realize enlightenment. So there are elements that we find in the other aspects as well, looking at individual liberations. The path that led to Tantra actually began during the path of altruism and the Bodhisattva. And there's lots of those kind of teachings that are a part of that, just not addressed in quite the same way as they are in the context of the path of Tantra. So the path of Tantra introduces the yogas of what is sometimes referred to as yidam practices to kind of fast track the process, as I was indicating, of achieving liberation. There are three major divisions of these practices. The first one are preliminary practices that we'll be going through, and then the generation stage, and then the completion stage. So there's three major divisions in the way this is typically taught. And then there are multiple elements within each of those. So this can get fairly complex. These practices are considerably more detailed than those in the previous paths. So I have divided it into 6 different chapters in this book, instead of 3 that we had in the others. But previously, we looked at it in terms of the ethics and then the meditation and then the wisdom aspect. But here it's divided up into more complex kinds of views that are a part of that. So these practices are considered to be more detailed and are multiple elements of each. The practices are considerably more detailed than the previous paths, so that division that I talked about. So most of the practices are described by Padmasambhava in his Natural Liberation text that are in this and the Path of Great Perfection part of the book. And so there are huge volumes of sources that could be used for these kind of things. But that book, The Natural Liberation, which is said to be teachings by Padmasambhava, I'm skeptical about whether he actually taught them, but at least that's one of the traditions, is that individuals with a famous name or individual recognition are often in Tibetan Buddhism referred to as having written something that scholars say, well, no, they didn't actually do that. But that doesn't matter so much, because what we're trying to do is find a way of doing the practice. And the way of doing the practice is actually a good way. So many sources include the Path of Great Liberation within the Path of Tantra. However, it is sufficiently unique with no yidams, no generation stage, no completion stage, that I've separated it into its own path. So that's the Dzogchen practices. So we'll treat those as a separate approach. And then the root Tan in Tantra means extend, such as to extend knowledge, as in transcendent knowledge. Tantra is also explained as a weaving together, such as a weaving together of an ultimate and relative. And so we'll see that kind of thing sometimes, in the relative and the ultimate, sometimes even blend together, but oftentimes they're linked with each other in one way or another. And then personified often we'll see as male and female, often even in sexual union. Now that usually happens in the most advanced of these sections that we're going to look at. And the initial ones don't typically have that. They're single individuals, and so they don't get into the union of male and female. But we will get to that a little bit later on. So no one knows for sure when and where Tantra actually began, although there are several theories about that. Some sources trace the origin back to the fertility rituals of prehistory. That's a long ways back. Most are skeptical of that. But others trace it to the indigenous Indian tradition and their Vedic religion around the 2nd millennium BCE. About 500 BCE is when scholars say was the end of the original part of the Vedic tradition, the core part of the Vedic tradition, and there were other changes, and of course it carried through into what became Hinduism later on. So the Vedic religion would be around the 22nd millennium BCE up until the 6th century BCE. So that's about the same time. 5th century BCE is about when we think that the Buddha was born. And so the emphasis on the Vedic tradition had been in decline for some time by then. However, the evidence is that Tantra and the Vedic religion coexisted independently for some time. And in addition, the Tantra appears most strongly in regions not dominated by the Vedas, particularly the Northwest Bengal and South India, where we see in the 4th century CE. So I've run across a number of different scholarly articles recently talking about that a little bit, and part of what they're finding is that from other sources rather than Buddhist sources, because the Buddhist sources make it look like this all happened in the very beginning. But you go back to some other historical sources, and what it does is indicate that the Vedic tradition went into India, kind of central part of India, And so that was the tradition in the very beginning, about the time of the Buddha. So part of what happened then was the Vedic traditions, they were not in that elite, empowered kind of culture that is often described in the Buddhist traditions. They weren't really dominant. They weren't the leading form of culture and the system that they had of the different levels and dividing that up. They weren't at the top. That all came later as it expanded further into India and became increasingly dominant at that time. But this is not what the case was at the time of the Buddha. So then the emergence of Tantra coincides with another movement within India, the rise of the divine feminine. So minor female spirits were evaluated to, or elevated to actual goddesses, if you will, during the early centuries of the Common Era, CE. So it was about that point of transition. We began to see this cultural change in India at the time. And one of these factors has to do with an increasing relevance of the females. And so they were largely ignored, or they were very minor and so forth early on. But at this point, they started having a more significant role. And so in the book, I've got a quote here from Miranda Shaw, that Tantra emerges from a period of strong female participation in Buddhism from the 1st century BCE. So that's about the time that we're talking at, through the 1st century CE. So about 100 years before and 100 years after the beginning of the first millennium. So nuns wielded substantial political, economic, and social power through the patronage practices and imperial influence, while their literary efforts and participation in public festivals and dramatic performances signaled their cultural and civic prominence. So in other sources, these are non-Buddhist sources, but we're beginning to find this evidence for this kind of an increase in the understanding. And it was broader than just the influence of females and women in that, but it was also a change because of trade and so forth. There was more cultural exposure to other countries and other religions, and all of those kind of things were going on at this time. So then by the 6th century, there's evidence of emphasis on the divine feminine within many yidams being elevated to a goddess status. So they began out kind of low in terms of the representation within the culture, but by the 6th century, it was fairly significant. And then the first surviving written tantric texts emerged in the early 5th century. The earliest one that I've ever seen was dated to 425 CE, so 5th century, by which time the practices had been integrated into monastic Buddhism. So at the time of the Buddha, and we see texts now that make it sound like they had a monastic tradition at the time of the Buddha, but in fact, it was more of a practice for the idea of just being individual, out in the forest dwellers, those kind of things. There were no monasteries. There were a couple of places. It appears that perhaps they built up some huts. There was one, I don't remember his name, but an individual who made a donation around Deer Park, and they set up little huts out there close to the town where they could go in and they could beg for food and those kind of things. And then one Chinese visitor to India said that he was there about 630 CE. so around the same time, and he wrote notes about what he was seeing there, and he said that he found Tantra was being extensively practiced at that time. So we know early text 425, and we know his notes about his exposure to this visiting from China at around 630. So that gives us a window of opportunity to see during which this began to expand. So Tantra appears to have particularly protested against the rigid structure of the Vedic tradition. So by this time, the Vedic tradition was beginning to be more influential. And the area previously in which the Buddha was, there were some people from the Vedic tradition, but they were basically just individual practitioners who went out on their own. They didn't have the relationship with the people who were in power, the kings or princes or those kind of things that they had later. But by this time, around 630 CE, we began to see a relationship being built there with the Vedic tradition. And it has influences on Buddhism. So we'll see here momentarily. So we do know that it was originally a separate movement apart from either Hinduism or Buddhism. We're talking about Tantra now. In general, it was a counterculture movement, a little bit like we had in the 60s and 70s, if you will. The early texts take on a very contrarian view to that of the Indian Vedic culture at the time. That is, whatever was generally prohibited in the culture was accepted by practice by tantrikas. First, it was dominated by women. In a parochial society, although men increasingly became part of the movement, they would go into the forest to practice in secret. Reginald Ray, you may have heard of him, wrote a book called Touching Liberation, writes about the call of the forest. So people, that part of the culture in India was as you developed and you went through a career that then you might go out into the forest to practice. And it may be a couple, the kids are gone, so they go out into the forest to practice and so forth. And that was part of their culture. So within Indian culture, the forest was considered the ideal place for spiritual practice because in the forest there are no rules and there are no presiding authorities. This was an ideal place to practice Tantra. So it appears that the practice of Tantra was largely dominated by females rebelling against the male-dominated culture of India and its rigid social and religious norms, resembling the American counterculture, as I mentioned, of the 1960s. When the culture told them what to wear, they went naked. When they were told not to eat meat or drink alcohol, they ate meat and drank alcohol. When they were restricted in what they could do sexually, they had sex openly and freely. The early theme seemed to be one of intentionally violating all the rules. In the beginning, it appears that males participated only to consummate the ritual sex aspect, and they were not permitted to have orgasm. It might be one male in a group of, say, half a dozen females. And so they were supposed to have sex with each one of those. So if you have an orgasm, then that's not likely to be effective after that. And so there were ritualistic reasons that have been factors as well as a part of that. But we're not going to get into that now. We'll talk more about Tantra a little bit later. The results of the rise of Tantra, however, and the goddess movements led to the absorption of both Buddhism and Hinduism. So we saw this movement emerge into both of those two. Now, Hinduism as a unique religious tradition what emerged out of the Upanishads, not the Vedas. The Upanishads came out of the Vedas, but the Upanishads were the ones that were influential in terms of the development of the tradition of Hinduism. And in particular, it was around 3rd century or the 4th century, somewhere in there, that Hinduism really began to move. And it's a little bit like what we see in Christianity, for example. Christianity looks at itself as a part of the early tradition in the Bible, the Old Testament kinds of things of the Jewish tradition, and yet they don't consider themselves to be Jews. And it was a little bit like that here, in that the Hindus considered themselves not to be Vedas, but they also had a relationship, and some of that was a part of their tradition in a similar way. So in Buddhism, the movement was largely monasticized, that is, adapted to fit to the dominant monastic tradition and Buddhist principles. Now, this is something that's happening when this is going on. Okay, so the 600s, 700s, and so forth, we began to see monastic traditions happening here. Since monks and nuns took vows of celibacy, they were generally prohibited from participating in a literal way. It became a highly symbolic practice said to significantly speed up the process of attaining liberation. So that was kind of the rationale behind the inclusion of this. We see the result of the generation and completion stage practices of the Path of Tantra. Mostly in the completion stage later on. So the texts were adapted to process that involved visualization rather than actual sexual union. And so you've all seen probably pictures, Tonka paintings that show a male and female together in union. And so that's the symbolism that is being related to here. Other ritual elements, such as eating the 5 meats, so actually eating things that are made of actual meat, and drinking the 5 nectars and so forth. So these are things that were originally prohibited by the Buddha, were also modified later into symbolic representations of those. So they didn't actually drink blood and they didn't actually eat meat, but they had cookies or something, we might say, as symbols of those kind of things. And if you've gone through ritual kind of things in Tantra, then you've probably seen things similar to that. Now, sometimes they do actually include alcohol, but a lot of them don't include alcohol anymore. Nevertheless, some leaders, such as Atisha and Tsongkhapa, rejected or even prohibited followers from doing these practices at all. And so in the case of Atisha, you just don't do it. He wouldn't even let them take the empowerments for them, let alone actually do the practices. And so he allowed them the first empowerment, which is just the open empowerment to the introduction to the particular practice, but not anything having to do with sexual union or anything even close to that. And then the fourth one is one that is associated with our mind or status of mind and how that functions and so forth. And so he did allow those, but not the other two as a part of that. And so Tsongkhapa had a little bit different kind of an approach. He accepted the principle of this, but he himself refused to do it. And one of the things that emerged by the time that he was a significant factor in Tibet was that monastics take a vow not to engage in sexual union. And so he refused to engage in sexual union. And he said that the theory that was a part of that was that it speeds up the process of attaining liberation. And he said, well, I'm not going to do that. That's against the rules. I'll just attain liberation at the time of my death. Okay, so that was his approach, and he refused to let people in his tradition, or at least he included that as something that was rejected or prohibited from his followers. And so, nevertheless, while the tantric practices in the monastic tradition became highly ritualized, the yogis and yoginis continued to the practices in a more literal way because they didn't have those vows of celibacy. And so some monks and nuns also did that, and of course they got criticized quite a bit for doing that. The practice with an actual consort called Karmamudra, you may have heard that term, is fairly common in the West, became known as the lower path or the left-hand path. So we sometimes see it represented or articulated in that way. While it is rarely taught by lamas, since they are largely restricted from learning or doing these practices with an actual consort, so practice with a consort may be appropriate for householders who rarely take vows of celibacy that are taken by monks and nuns. Now, in this book, the text of the third edition, I moved almost all of the sexual representations into an appendix at the end. Okay, whereas before I would touch on it a little bit here and there as we moved through the process, but it felt more appropriate to the tradition to isolate it a little bit. And so that information is there. We're not going to go through it in the class, but you're certainly welcome to look at it yourselves. And then in Buddhism, the core of the practice is not about sex at all. In fact, using sexual desire as the path is designed to transform the experience of sexual bliss into transcendent bliss, beyond anything that can be expressed in words. And in the process, we eliminate sexual desire, which is considered to be the major obscuration of the human realm. We have those 6 different realms. In the human realm, desire, particularly sexual desire, but it's more broad than just that, is the major afflictive emotion associated with the human realm. And so most teachers consider the practice with an actual consort to be unnecessary and a potentially dangerous diversion. Thus, the predominant approach is through reciting and understanding this symbolic ritual to achieve transcendent bliss. So that is something that is acceptable. And a lot of the practices, especially when we get to that part later on, there will be examples of people that, male, female, are in union together. Technically, it could be 2 males together, 2 females together. It could be that the male is the dominant one or the female one. And there are actual pictures of some where the female is the dominant figure as well. So then the principal impact of Tantra on Buddhism, however, is the use of yidams in the meditation practices. Although this began earlier during the period dominated by the Path of Altruism, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, however, it is important to recognize this distinction between yidams of Buddhism and those of other religions, especially Hinduism, with which a number of them are shared. And during that time, the 6th, 7th, 8th century and so forth, and on even a little bit later, where both Buddhism and Hinduism were engaging in these kind of practices, although in somewhat different ways. That was one of the things that was a part of this, is that in Buddhism, I like the word yidam, although often you'll see in texts and so forth the word deity. But deity literally means gods. But these are not gods in the Buddhist tradition. And so yidam, which has a slightly different meaning than that, and one that most people aren't real familiar with, which I think helps us a little bit in a better understanding of what we're talking about here. And so that's my preference in terms of the term to use for these practices. And so then in Buddhism, all yidams are considered to be a manifestation of your mind. Okay, so we don't look at them as being something literal, and if we're not practicing with an actual consort, male or female, then that's not something that's absolutely necessary. They do not exist in the same way that other religions view deities or gods. Very different in the Buddhist approach, although over time it became increasingly to look in the same way that we see in other religions. Although some teachers object to this characterization, I have found that students in the West find the characterization as tools for meditation practice can be helpful in understanding both the role of yidams in practice and their very nature in terms of training the mind. So if we think of a yidam as a tool, so to speak, and something that we can use as a way of helping us in our practice, that's actually much closer to what the intention was of using these at all in terms of practice. So that's the way that I tend to advocate this, is that it's a way of using it in order to help facilitate our practice. So there's a vast number of these figures in the pantheon of Tibetan Buddhism. In general, they may be divided into peaceful and wrathful forms. Both help us to overcome our afflictive emotions, which goes back to the Buddha himself, the suffering that we have to overcome these afflictive emotions in order to become liberated. And so this is the same principle here. Afflictive emotions and mental obscurations, as I mentioned, are two very common terms that kind of collectively capture all of those things. And then one key difference is in the methods they employ, that is peaceful or wrathful, as indicated by their categories. However, the differences are not limited to just that. Peaceful yidams are usually also associated with outer tantras, that is, they are visualized as being outside of our bodies, whereas wrathful yidams are usually part of the inner tantras, which they become embodied in us and we become them. So visualizing yourself as a Buddha may be the most effective part of these practices for realizing liberation. It's like a role play, if you will. You think of yourself as being that Buddha during the practice. When you get up off of the cushion, you continue to think of yourself as that particular Buddha form. So that role play has been found to be very effective in psychology. And so that's one of the things that I think that we can actually take advantage of here. I haven't heard other people refer to it in that way, in that term as a role play, but I've seen a lot of examples where that's actually what they're talking about. So it can be very highly effective along with their other practices. And then furthermore, peaceful yidams are usually visualized as single figures. So when you're looking at a Thangka painting, you can almost always tell. If it's a single figure, then it is a peaceful yidam. Looking at one of the Buddha himself, looking at Chenrezig, looking at Tara, and so forth. There are exceptions, we'll mention in a minute here. And the wrathful ones usually have a consort. So we have the two figures together, and we look at the Thangka paintings when you see usually a male and female, although there's some variations, then those then are typically wrathful. And they're usually in sexual union as an esoteric or radical kind of an approach. So we think of it that way. Symbolically, the female represents the transcendent wisdom and the male represents skillful means, which is like loving kindness and compassion. And we tend to think of the female more often in terms of those kind of skillful means in our culture, but here it's reversed in terms of that aspect. The female is the one that is associated with the wisdom aspect, and the male is more associated with the loving kindness and compassion aspect. So tantric practices are often further divided into two stages. Now the language here gets a little complicated, so follow along carefully. So there are tantric practices divided into two stages: generation and completion. So the generation stage, so I'm going to use the words stage versus phases. So the generation stage is the generation of a visualization of the yidam and their associated environment, the mantra recitation, meditation, and may include other prayers or rituals. So in the text, the practice text, those are the kind of things that we see, the dominant aspects. So there's the visualization of the particular figure, and then there's an environment in which there activities, things are going on. You've probably seen some of those. And then we recite the mantra, and then we go into meditation as a part of that. And then we come back out of that with other kind of including prayers and so forth. That's the basic structure. They can get really complex or real simple. The generation stage is further divided into generation and completion phases. Okay? So the generation phase here is just the initial generation of the yidam. And then the completion phase is the next part of the generation stage, and the dissolution, that the visualization into emptiness. Okay, so does that make sense? And then at that point, you rest in the meditative equipoise and then follow with the concluding prayers. The completion stage, on the other hand, now, so bigger picture part of this, refers to the inner practices such as the 6 yogas of Niropa or the 6 yogas of Naguma. These include practices such as inner heat, which is Tumo, illusory body, dream yoga, clear light, transference or Poa, and Bardos. So those are the most common practices that are associated with that phase. And so the basic approach in Tantra is to understand yourself as a Buddha or yidam. You practice being a Buddha in body, you visualize yourself in that way. Speech is the mantra, and then the mind is the dissolution and the meditation. And then you arise from practice on the cushion and act as if you are a Buddha, as I mentioned before. As a bumper sticker once said, I haven't seen one for a long time, but what would Buddha do? And so that's kind of what we would think of here as a part of doing this. You then do your best to do that as you continue to study and do formal practice. So the idea of doing practice is it's setting up the rest of our daily activities. We don't just do practice and then forget about it for the rest of the day. And so the idea is that role play. Okay, you set the role up through doing the practice, and then when you get off the cushion, you still imagine that you are that yidam, and you go about your activities during the day following the associated qualities, characteristics, actions of that particular yidam. And it can be very, very effective. So while these practices are said to enable you to achieve liberation in this lifetime, most branches of the tradition also include advanced non-dual practices of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, which we won't really look at Mahamudra very much, but Dzogchen later on when we get through with Tantra. These practices focus on transcendent wisdom itself. The visualizations previously employed in practices are no longer considered necessary at that point, although some of the actual practices still use visualizations in Dzogchen, for example. Mahamudra and Dzogchen are directed
at finalizing your attainment of liberation in this lifetime. The essence of the state of liberation is the mind of a Buddha. And so even the Buddha himself referred to this as training the mind. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to do here. And so then the essence of the state of liberation is the mind of the Buddha. So we train our mind so that we attain that state of having a mind of the Buddha, often articulated as emptiness. We'll talk more about that later, or pure awareness, which is also a term that we'll talk about later. So that gives a real rough overview to Tantra and what is involved in that. So for today, I wanted to go ahead, we've got a little bit of time left, and go into the next chapter, chapter 11 in the text, on the Path of Tantra, which is the ethics aspect of this. So this is what we refer to as the third vow sometimes. So we did the refuge vow was the first vow. The Bodhisattva vow was the second one. And so now we have this third vow in the Tantra. So I summarized the first two of these as do good or at least do no harm for the benefit of all beings. That's a fairly concise summary of the refuge vow and the Bodhisattva vow together. So all beings are viewed as Buddhas, all sounds as mantra, all thoughts as the wisdom of a Buddha, and all phenomena as a Buddha field, a pure land or abode of a Buddha. And all of these then are considered to be sacred. So that is this third vow, is looking at everything as being sacred, as if it's already, all beings, everybody you see, you look at thinking, at least innately, they are already a Buddha, okay? And the similar with the other things, the sounds, all the sounds that you hear are a mantra. And then all thoughts that you have are also the wisdom of a Buddha. And phenomena, everything that we see, those outside things basically represent a Buddha field. Okay? So that is a core aspect of the view of the Tantra and how we use the practice in order to train our mind, and our actions for that matter. So all of these are considered to be sacred. And then in the beginning, you imagine this to be the case. With practice and understanding, you begin to realize that this is actually true in our mind. Okay? There is no longer any need to imagine it to be true. In the ground of purity and equality, everything is none other than a natural mandala. So we begin viewing everything as a mandala, and we are seeing ourselves as a form of Buddha, and we are all a part of that. Now, not very many people actually, I mean, they'll say this, but my experience is a lot of lamas don't really talk about it other than just presenting that and then going on as a part of it. But it is another way of training our mind throughout the day and night, even our sleep, our dreams. We can look at them that same way. But we'll talk more about this later. Here, it is sufficient to note that what we do off the cushion is as important as, or even more important than, what we do on the cushion. So ethics form a foundation for which we do during our meditation, but also what we do afterwards during the rest of our day. And that was really true before as well, when we took those vows in terms of the ethical views of the path of individual liberation and the path of altruism. We still need to do those things. We can't just recite it and say that's it. We have to actually embody those characteristics and qualities. So here we continue. In addition, there are numerous other specific vows in the tantric tradition, In attempting to apply these, keep in mind the 4 reliances back in chapter 3. That's always a good thing to look at. The core principles are the 14 root downfalls, also taken by ordinary lay practitioners, so it's not just a monastic kind. Referred to as nakpas and nagmas. So nakpas are male and nagmas are female. And then, so these are a class of, as it says in the footnote down there, the male and female lay practitioners, mostly just in the Nyingma tradition. So this is one of the first or most advanced things that I did before I got these labels put on my name by Khenchen Lama. And so it's a commitment that we're making in our life beyond just being an ordinary practitioner, that we are doing the best that we can. And in the culture in Tibet at that time, particularly if we look at the early historical tradition, if you recall, we did a little bit of a history early on, when Buddhism went into Tibet and it was starting to grow, and then one of the kings kind of crushed it all and destroyed the monasteries and so forth. He didn't do quite as much harmful things as sometimes said, but in any case, it went local. It went, because no monastics and so forth, so they didn't have anybody to do those things, teach those things and so forth. They did it themselves. And so this class emerged as a part of that. And so the existing monastics that were there would then give these monastic vows, the Nakpa and Nagma vows, to people who became like an individual in a little village or something that would help them in learning about Buddhism and doing practice and so forth. But they weren't monastic, okay? So that is something that's there. And then in addition, you are expected to avoid the 18 Bodhisattva downfalls, which we looked at previously from the Path of Altruism, and the 10 unwholesome actions from the Path of Individual Liberation, which we also looked at. So we don't give those up. And then while these are fairly self-explanatory, they are detailed teachings and or texts available for those wanting further explanation of those. We gave some basic information earlier on. So a word of caution here, we begin to get into some very deep levels of Buddhism that include terminology that may not be familiar or understanding to beginners. Now, I know many of you have already been involved, and so you probably have run across these kind of things before, but all of you may not have familiarity with those. At this point, it is not important that you group each of these in detail, that you learn and practice them in detail, but that you get the general idea of the kinds of ethics that are part of this level of vows. And so these are the 14 root downfalls. I'm going to go through each one of these, a little bit of commentary, but mostly just reading through them for you. The first one is criticizing your Vajra master. So whoever your guru, your lama is, you don't criticize them, even if you do disagree with them. You can go ask questions and that kind of thing, but you don't criticize them. And then transgressing teachings of the Buddha is number 2. Well, I don't agree with this thing that the Buddha said and those kind of things. That's considered inappropriate. Number 3, out of anger, which is, of course, not something we should be doing anyway, being hostile toward your Vajra brothers and sisters. So it kind of reinforces that one, but in the context of other Buddhist practitioners. Number 4, forsaking love for all sentient beings. That's pretty much the Bodhisattva vow as well that we've already looked at. Number 5, abandoning bodhicitta for the benefit of all sentient beings. And so that's giving up the Bodhisattva vow that we did previously. And so we don't give that up. And then in some cases on these lists, there are other versions. And this verse is one of those. So one of those is no illicit sexual activity. Okay, you're married or you've got a partner or something like that you're with, then that's not the issue here. But other kinds of things. Well, we also had a vow as a part of that in the 5 vows earlier on. And then disparaging our own or others' beliefs. So one of the things, this is a little bit more unique, although there were elements of this in the Bodhisattva vow as well. There's going to be differences even within Buddhism in general, and Tibetan Buddhism specifically. And so the idea here is that we don't disparage them. It's okay if people don't agree with this or they don't believe something that we believe in, okay? We just let them say their piece, and you can say what you believe or something like that, but you don't get into arguments and so forth. And then, number 7, revealing secrets of the Tantra to those not ready to understand. This is one of the more commonly referred to ones by lamas in doing teachings, and oftentimes they will say something about this in empowerment. So, because of the instructions that are a part of that process, what we are saying here is that we don't share that with other people. People that aren't in Buddhism and so forth, they're not really ready to understand, and it very easily could result in them misunderstanding it. And so that is a potential part of the problem here. So it's important that they have a background. It's not that you can't say some things. People will ask. I've had lots of people who are not Buddhists who will ask questions about it, and I feel it's fine to give some basic information. But you want to be careful about getting into areas which may cause them to become negative about it. Sometimes you can't help that, but you want to be careful about saying those kind of things. Number 8 is abusing your own embodied being as impure. So we don't think of ourselves as impure, as we just talked about a moment ago. We were talking about that we are a Buddha. We're not impure. And so we look at ourselves in that way. And then number 9, indulging doubts about naturally pure Dharma. So the idea is that we don't doubt the teachings that we are given on these things. They are naturally pure in essence. Now, we may have questions about language or terminology and those kind of things, but we are told here to not doubt the pure Dharma. Okay. Now, pure Dharma goes beyond, and we could define that in different ways, and different branches of Buddhism have certainly done that as well. But we have to be careful about doubts. If you have doubts, the usual suggestion is ask your teacher, or somebody that you know that is an advanced practitioner, those kind of things. And then number 10, when qualified, so there's a condition here, refraining from stopping others from doing harm. So that is something that is a risky thing to do. And we see it sometimes in the Bodhisattva teachings, where you're told to allow yourself to be killed or whatever as a part of this kind of thing. But that's one that we have to be careful about. Hence, when qualified. So it's for somebody who is very, very qualified in a very, very specific practice that we would do those kind of things. Number 11, claiming to be realized when not. I like to tell a little story with that one, because one time, a long time ago, I was in a car, and a friend of mine who was also a practitioner asked me just straightforward, she says, "Are you enlightened?" And I kind of laughed a little bit, and I said, if I told you I was, I wouldn't be. And I think that's kind of relevant. We don't tell people that we are enlightened, even if we are, but then I did add that no, I'm not at that time. So we want to be careful about exaggerating those things. And the meaning of being enlightened varies a little bit from one teacher to another, one person to another, and so forth. But it infers that we are fully embodied in all of these teachings, which can be a big challenge. We can do it. I wouldn't deny that. There's certainly the possibilities, and that's a big part of what this is all about in the Tantra tradition, is that we actually do it in this lifetime. This is another one that has an alternative, or not living or practicing the view of emptiness. For example, nihilism or permanence. So nihilism and permanence are two of those things that the Buddha himself rejected. Nihilism is a rejection of all religious or moral principles, and so certainly that's not appropriate. And so we want to avoid those kind of things. Permanence has to do with never having an end to life. Now, I would say that most of the things that we see today in Tibetan Buddhism appear to be permanent. So you die, you go to a Buddha realm, you never die. That's permanent. That was one of the things that the Buddha himself rejected. Now we'll have to individually decide how we're going to deal with that. That it is one of those terms that has kind of shifted over time from the original teachings of the Buddha. Okay, then number 12, deriding the practices of others. So we don't argue against people that believe in other religions, is what this one is about. Okay? People have those religions. If those religions are being beneficial and helpful to them, that's fine. And then number 13, failing to understand or keep other samayas. Now the word samaya is a commitment or a promise that are sometimes things that we make associated with an empowerment, or in other cases it may be a teaching that is given, and the Lama asks you to do a certain number of repetitions of something, a practice or a mantra, and those kind of things. But this is another one that has an alternative. It's not taking what is offered as impure. Now this would be, for example, in an empowerment where you have made a commitment not to drink alcohol. And the empowerment is involving a small amount of alcohol. It could be just pour a tiny drop of it into the palm of your hand or something like that. But, and I've had some of these, somebody who's a recovering alcoholic, they just didn't want to do that. And what I do as the helper of the Lama giving the empowerment is, instead of, and sometimes they'll tell you if you're helping out, they'll tell you that they don't do that. And so what they do is either hold their hand upside down and you just touch it, and usually you have a little vase or something, you just touch the top of their hand, or perhaps touch it on the crown of their head. We don't require people, or shouldn't require people, to do those kind of things. And then number 14, the last one here, is abusing or deriding a woman. The nature of wisdom. Now, we mentioned before that they're considered to be, the female is considered to be the wisdom aspect of the tradition. And so we don't deride them or abuse them in any way associated. So those are the 14 root downfalls. Many of them we've seen before in other of the collections that we've been exposed to. And so finally here, there are other vows, sometimes included in the advanced tantric practice. Two of these are the 25 branch samayas, which is very highly symbolic representation. And so it's beyond, I put it in the original book, but it's just beyond, it would take a whole chapter just to explain that one, so I took it back out. And then the Mother Tantra Vows, which actually are in the book, and they're included in one of the appendices. And so those are the basic tantric vows that we do as a part of the tradition. So hopefully you understand those. But if you have questions, please just send me an email, and I'll do my best to give you an answer to those things as well. So thank you very much for participating today and putting up with this, and we'll get into the details as we begin moving through this, which can be very complicated, but also can be really, really interesting to do. So thank you again.